Onassis Foundation.
Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengraber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello, could I please speak with Romila Thapar?
Yeah, this is Romila speaking.
Romila, what a pleasure to have you on the phone. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know it's quite late now. It's quite late now in India. Where do I find you at this moment?
Well, I'm at home. I've had dinner and I'm sitting and waiting for the call. It's about 10 o'clock at night.
I know. It's so extraordinary to know that it's 12 and a half hours different from Los Angeles. So where is home? Can you tell our listeners?
In Delhi, where you visited.
I visited. I will never forget that room where we actually did have dinner before having drinks.
Yes.
I loved the rounded bookshelves. I will never forget that I felt completely enclosed, which was wonderful.
Yes.
And what, tell me, for the last 3 or 4 months, how have you been living your quarantine, and is it any different than life as usual?
Well, it is different in the sense that, there's a lockdown, there has been, and it's slowly being lifted. And the lockdown means that, ideally one's always said to oneself how nice it would be to be in self-isolation.
Yes.
But when the isolation is imposed on you, and you absolutely can't go anywhere, and you can't meet anybody, then it becomes very difficult.
And how different is it to be alone knowing this, and to be alone the way you usually are, I imagine?
Well, it's at one level a little frightening, because one keeps on thinking, if something happens to me, what am I going to do? And it's a little more frightening here because, our medical facilities have been shown up to be virtually non-existent.
Right.
And this has been terrible because, suddenly this catastrophe has, as it were, opened up the innards of the whole system of governance and administration and so on. And you suddenly realize how absolutely impossible it is. It's unworkable.
In a way, this moment has highlighted certain features of society.
The moment has highlighted it, yes. I mean, the moment has highlighted. At one level, one has this personal sense of uncertainty. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Will the virus catch you, or will you go free for the next few days? At what point of time will you be caught by it? It's this invisible enemy that's floating around and you don't know what to do with it. And at another level, you suddenly begin to see that the system that you thought was working and you lived with actually isn't working all that well. In some cases, it's not working at all.
I wonder what you mean by the system, and I wonder if you thought it ever really did work.
Well, what I mean by the system is, the immediacy of the way we live, what we surround ourselves with, the facilities that we use, and then the administration of those facilities. If you take something like medicine, for example, you suddenly realize that you can't find beds in hospitals. You find hospitals not admitting patients because they're overcrowded. And you begin to start asking yourself, what happened? What happened to the idea of health care? It doesn't exist. And it's the same kind of thing with how do you go shopping? Where do you go shopping? What are the kinds of things you have to do? It's really a kind of strange way of questioning one's whole way of having accepted life and having accepted the way it works. And now beginning to start asking questions about it.
Which, Romila, I think you in particular have never stopped asking. And in a sense, the question is, what kind of questions are people asking now? And what kind of answers are they hoping for?
Well, there's fundamentally, for example, the whole question of medical facilities has become very, very central and has surfaced in a big way. All this talk about healthcare and so on, you suddenly realize that there's all talk and nothing really actually happened. But I think there are other things that matter too, which is not just happening in India, but is happening in other parts of the world. The incompetence of many governments, for example, where one had always thought that basic things like social equality and that kind of the way in which one lives, the ethics of living, we took it all for granted. We assumed that it existed. And you suddenly discover that, in fact, it doesn't exist. It is not what is commanding social relations. When I talk about the incompetence of many governments, you take something like what's happening in America today.
Yes. Black
Lives Matter. One didn't know last year that this was there, and it's suddenly been revealed. And for example, in our case, when it was announced that there was going to be a lockdown at 4 hours notice, millions of people just lost their jobs.
Right,
they weren't paid their current wages. They lost their jobs. So what did they do? They said, we're going home. Home was hundreds of miles away.
Right.
And
I remember
the system, the governmental.
I remember Naveen talking.
And the governmental system did nothing to help them. And there they were, these people walking home.
I remember Naveen. I remember Naveen Kishore telling me about that extraordinary moment where you had just a few hours to react, which itself is tremendously cruel. Tremendously cruel,
but also I think, you don't do this to people. They've never known what a lockdown is. I didn't know what a lockdown was. And my first is, oh my God, do I have enough food for the household? And so people rushed around madly and so on. You have to do these things in a much more systematic way and think about what it means to people. And this is where I think, when I talk about the collapse of the system,
yes.
The thing that worries me enormously is that we had assumed that societies were based on ethical norms, that we behaved ethically towards each other. And you suddenly find that is not the case. People don't seem to care. The humanism seems to have gone out. Everything in life has become a commodity, and commodity is what matter. I'm not saying that this is 100%, because there have been some marvelous groups of people, young people and NGOs and so on, who've helped in an absolutely magnificent way. But the thing is that the way it should have gone, the basics, that was lacking, that was missing. And that is really frightening. Can we go on living like this in the future? And I've been giving a little thought to that as well.
What do you think?
Well, I think that the immediate thing today, right now, is that the whole healthcare system has to be revamped. I'm talking about the Indian situation. We simply have to come to terms with the fact that you cannot have such a huge population that is open to all kinds of ill health and disease and so on, which takes on the proportions of the pandemic. But then there's also, the other side of it, which is that there are many things that need to be attended to. But still, basically, I think, my thoughts arise from the fact that people when we talk on the telephone with friends, people talk about when we get back to normal.
Right.
And I ask myself, what do we mean by getting back to normal?
Yeah, my mother used to always say, get back to what passes for normal.
And so one thinks about, what do we mean when we say democracy? And I was thinking to myself that maybe we have to reconsider the definition of these terms. For example, if I can just go on a little bit longer on this.
Please.
I was asking myself, what would be the face of democracy after this crisis is over? And I thought of it in terms of functioning in two ways, at two levels, in two streams, perhaps. One would be a basic fundamental level stream, call it what you will, where every citizen of a country is guaranteed the rights of citizenship. And what do I mean by the rights of citizenship? I think it's a kind of hierarchy that one has to consider. You start off with the basics of food, water, shelter. You move to employment. And one of the things that has come through very sharply after the Indian experience is that anybody who is employed must have a legal contract of employment. The employer has to guarantee that if the job comes to a close, the person will be given a wage. This didn't happen because the majority of labor in this country is casual. So there has to be that written into it. There has to be a compulsory nationalized healthcare service and a nationalized educational service, because these are two very important components of the rights to citizenship. And then there has to be social justice to ensure social equality, because the one thing that's come through very strongly all over the world in this pandemic is the lack of social equality, quite fundamentally. Now, I regard all of this as being something that every country has to do, and possibly we can scrap globalization as it exists at the moment, but perhaps some kind of global structure can be brought in to monitor the existence of these rights for every country. I think that would be a great help if there was somebody looking over your shoulder and saying, no, you're not doing the right thing. You're not giving the rights that are deserving. Now, I'm not arguing that all the rights go to the citizens. Citizens keep on making demands. There are duties as well. But today what happens is that the state keeps on emphasizing the duty of the citizen, but never talks about the guarantee of the rights.
Right.
And I think that is something that we have to fundamentally insist on after this crisis is over, if the crisis is ever over.
This
has to be a
You so interestingly talk about globalization in the essay you published in the Goethe Institute in March 2020.
I did talk about that because I must confess that
it's so interesting. You say, it's so interesting. You say, can globalization be defended as a continuing future form? Today, all our aspirations are being cremated daily, and one waits for the devastation of the earth.
Yes, I'm sorry. I have no use for globalization as it exists.
Why?
I think it's been a failure.
Why?
But I think that it could play a different role in the sense of ensuring the rights of citizens all over the world, in every country. I mean, globalization could be a monitoring system. That would be a different function altogether.
Romila, you have spoken.
And I also understand that, if I'm suggesting this basic foundational layer, it has to be continuous. It doesn't matter which political party is in government. That has to be guaranteed. And so for that, there has to be a special financial outlay which must not be eaten into. It has to be there all the time. Which means, of course, a lot of meaning that, the finances required for running such a system have to be present. And so that means, changing your laws of property rights and taxes and this, that, and the other, making some difference. But that foundational level just simply has to exist. Otherwise, I think we really have failed altogether. And beyond that, above that, in a different stream, you can play around, people can play around to some degree, not to any degree, but to some degree. But this basic thing has absolutely to be guaranteed, I think. Otherwise, there really isn't very much future to the way we would exist. I mean, there are other issues as well, which I don't know. Do we have time to go into those?
We're going to go into many other issues, but there's one thing I would like to address, which are the two kinds of history you find. History as an academic discipline and history as used in politics. And you say the two cannot be confused. Tell us what these two strands are and how dangerous it is when we do confuse them.
You're asking me to give you, in a nutshell, my entire life history.
Exactly. How did you get it? You got it perfectly.
This is what I've been.
I know. In a nutshell.
This is what
In a nutshell, your last 90 years, please.
No, the thing is that I treat history as a way of understanding and explaining the past. I don't sit in judgment on it. I'm not looking for the truth because I'll never find it. One never does. The past is gone. But one can try and explain and understand it. And why is it important? Because if you understand and explain the past properly, in understandable terms that make sense, you understand the present much better. And God knows we do need to understand the present and what's going on if we're going to talk about the future. So the three of them are very much interrelated. What do I mean by explaining and understanding history and the past? I mean that you use whatever sources you can get hold of, and historians now use an incredible range of sources. You also analyze them. You first of all test the reliability of the source that you're using. You can't just talk out of fantasy, out of the top of your head. You have to have something concrete to back up what you're saying. So you test the evidence, you analyze it, you make your causal relationships that a particular event happened because the following factors took place. And that is a kind of logical link-up that you give. And then finally, you may come to a generalization and say that, this body of events and this is what happened, etc., and this is likely to be the result that came out of it. Keeping in mind the fact always that all knowledge is liable to change, depending on new evidence coming in, depending on new methods of analysis. Nobody who has access to any kind of knowledge can say, this is absolutely definitive, final, because there's always something else that comes up. Now, that's one way of looking at history and looking at the past, and that's the way which has intellectually excited me enormously right through my life. What we're up against in many societies, perhaps a little less so, but I'm beginning to wonder now after what has been happening as a result of the pandemic in Europe and America. I think it applies to every society practically. And that is that political parties try and legitimize themselves by constructing the past in a particular way which makes their ideology inevitable. That is, I have a certain ideology, this is what I want to do with my society, and so I construct the past in a way in which I try and suggest that the logic is that it's leading up to the point that I am trying to emphasize and trying to bring in. That is the politicization of history. Am I making myself clear?
Completely. Carlo Ginzburg recently said that fascism has a future.
Fashion?
Fascism.
Sorry, was it fashion or passion?
No, fascism. 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 Fascism.
Oh, fascism.
Fascism has a future. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, I think I would agree with that, because again, one of the things that the pandemic has shown up is the number of governments that have become extremely authoritarian. And this is not going to stop. I mean, once you get the feel that you can manipulate society and that you can control society, then it becomes very easy to do so. And you will go on doing it, and you'll go on pushing it as much as you can, because after all, basically, most politicians are greedy for power and authority.
I know that in the case of Carlo Ginzburg, the idea of using the word fascism as it applies to this current moment is something that he has been scrupulously trying to avoid, but can no longer do.
Well, I mean, this is something that many people have thought of also. We may use euphemisms like authoritarianism or dictatorships or even totalitarian tendencies and so on. But the ultimate thing is that if you have complete authority, then you inevitably move in the direction of fascism. And that is certainly very...
Go ahead.
Sorry?
No, go ahead, please.
And I think that is very disturbing in the present thing, because it's not that it's coming in legitimately, as it were. It's coming in through the back door, that you got the idea for doing this and you can do it very easily in a situation because it's a crisis situation. But you're not going to stop once, if this crisis lessens. Your authoritarianism isn't going to lessen. You're going to push it harder. And this is where I'm also worried about something which is partly connected with what recent events in America and here and elsewhere. The coming of the scapegoat into politics, as I call it.
Tell me.
That political power picks on a particular community for whatever reason, race, religion, language, whatever it may be. And that community becomes the enemy within. And you build up a whole range of hatred around this relationship, which you then use again for coming to power and for destroying the whole notion of social justice and liberty and the freedom of speech and so on. I think this is a very real danger that we are facing at the moment, and we should be aware of it. We should be sensitive to the fact that this is another aspect of what I was talking about earlier. I mean, this is an aspect of political ethics in a way at one level, but it is also an aspect of very strong, determined political authoritarianism at another level. And we're all witnessing it, we're all experiencing it.
Romila, you met, I mean, it's extraordinary to think, but you met Gandhi. And what do you make of the form of civil disobedience he advocated? And would those methods, do you think, work in today's world?
Well, let me say that I met Gandhi when I was really just a teenager.
Yes.
I knew a little bit about civil disobedience because at that stage in the early 40s, it was all over. Everybody was talking about it. And I met him I went to one of his prayer meetings like an enthusiastic teenager.
Yes.
I asked him to sign my little photograph album, which he did. And then he ticked me off and said, "Why are you wearing clothes made cloth? You should be wearing hand-woven khadi." And so I rushed home and said to my mother, "I'm going to throw away all these clothes. I'm only going to wear khadi." Of course, that lasted 3 months and then it was all over. But that notion has stayed with me. It's interesting that you asked me this question because, one of the things that I've been doing these last 3 months in self-isolation is that I've been trying to answer this question of how do cultures and civilizations articulate dissent? because I think dissent is absolutely crucial to the health of any society, particularly a society that calls itself full of replete with cultural forms and civilized. And so I took up the Indian case, and I've been going through from 1000 BC up till now. The earlier part of this discussion was simply on what were the different modes of dissent, how did people dissent, and why did they dissent the way they did, and so on. The latter part, what interested me very much, was not just Gandhi working out what he called Satyagraha, the civil disobedience movement, which many people have worked on very in a very fine way and so on. I was interested in why did he get this huge public response. It was quite fantastic, the way people totally responded to him. They called him the great soul, the Mahatma. They were willing to sort of do anything, so on. And for me, this is all part of a certain tradition, a kind of underbelly of Indian civilization, which has been this dissenting tradition, which I think is extremely important. And so I came round to the conclusion that what we have to do is, when we talk about our civilization, we mustn't forget that although there were people that created great things in philosophy and thought, in art, in culture, in literature, and so on, the kind of thing that civilization is described by, there were certain social situations that were anything but happy situations, such as the different aspects of caste and caste discrimination. But we must also not forget that there were people who were dissenting, who were trying to change the social situation and were trying to reorient the idea of what was meant by what we today call high culture or civilization or that kind of thing. And I think in that, in many ways, we will probably come back to notions of civil disobedience being perhaps much more apposite than outright violent protest. I'm not sure. This is something that I'm still thinking about, but I think it bears thinking about for every society.
Yes. And
that if you're going to protest, if you're going to dissent, there is not just a single way of doing it. There are other ways of doing it, and there are other ways that may be a little more effective.
Romila, in closing and briefly, I'd like to ask you a little bit to tell me about something that seems so intriguing, which is your China journal.
My China journal. Well, this goes back, 62 years.
Goodness me.
Shows you how terribly...
It shows how terribly alive you are, Romila.
It shows what old I am.
No, I beg to differ. How alive you are.
Well, we won't argue on that.
Okay, let's.
So this was 1950.
1950.
This is 1957, and I was a student. I was doing my PhD at London University, and a friend of mine, or an acquaintance really, who was working on Buddhist art and sculpture. Just out of the blue, I'd helped her a little bit with some of the research. She suddenly rang me up and said she'd got an invitation to go to China and to work at two Buddhist cave sites. One is the very famous Dunhuang on the edge of the Gobi Desert, and the other was a site called Meiji-san. And would I come as a research assistant? And I really didn't know too much about China, not having studied it in any detail, but I had done a little course on Chinese art and archaeology. So I joined in, and it was more really the fun of it, and also the fact that, I was going to these two places which were really quite extraordinary places. So we spent about 3.5 months in China. We worked for a month each at the two sites. Then we went to all the museums that had objects and one or two other places. And I kept a kind of rather silly, chatty travelogue journal. Here we went, this is what we did, this is what we saw, and so on. and then forgot all about it. And a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, I was going through some papers, and suddenly this wad of papers turned up with my scribbles on what I had written. And a couple of friends who saw it just out of interest said to me that it really makes quite interesting reading, because it is China as it was in 1957.
Incredible.
Just the start of the revolution. And before the big breakthroughs had come, what was the ambiance like? So I just pulled it out. I left it exactly as I had written it, more or less, except for the odd sentence here and there explaining things. Otherwise, it's basically that. And I put it together, and it's going to be published sometime. I don't know when.
How wonderful.
It was supposed to.
I can't wait to read it. Romila, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. I wish we had more time. I really, really enjoyed our conversation. I had so many more things to ask you, of course, including, how history is being taught today, and how children in particular should learn to learn about history. I always remember that wonderful line of Margaret Mead where she said, children must be taught how to think, not what to think.
She's absolutely right. And this is the intention, behind a lot of what I've written. For example, the textbooks that I wrote for children, where the intention was entirely to get children to think about what they were reading, rather than simply reading it and learning it by rote, that kind of thing. I think the capacity to think is absolutely fundamental in any kind of educational system. This is a subject on which we could have another session altogether.
Please, let's do that. I hope in person. I hope to come back to India, which I loved that trip so deeply, so very much, and I'm ever grateful that it was possible and that I got to meet you in your library. Next time, I hope you take me into your bagicha and show me your garden.
Yes. Indeed.
All the best to
you. Indeed, I will take you.
All the best to you. Bye-bye.
And thank you, Paul.
So much.
It was good talking to you.
It's so excellent talking to you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.